Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to another historian's interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is an historian making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today is a historian specializing in medieval and, more recently, early modern European history. Her research focus on the history of magic, medicine, and popular religion is super fascinating. And honestly, I am so excited to dive into those later in this interview. Currently, she is engaged in two projects, one exploring medieval views of infertility, and the other involving collaborative work on magic in the archives of the Inquisition in Malta. She enjoys sharing her work with broader audiences, and since 2007, she has been affiliated with the University of Exeter, where she has held various teaching, research, and administrative management roles. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, historian Dr. Catherine Ryder. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Hello, welcome. Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Awesome, Catherine. I'm so excited to have you here. Now, before we dive into your background as an historian and what led you to this position, a fun little question to begin with. Is there a little fun fact about yourself that not a lot of people know?
Oh, it's a good one. I used to do belly dancing back in my youth. That was always a good one. I don't do
Love
that.
it.
I used to. It was good fun.
Nice. Very, very nice. So, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I'm super excited to dive deep into not just your background, but also your research specializations. And really, really intrigued by the emphasis of magic. I think that's the first time I've actually read magic in the bio of an historian. I'm very, very intrigued by that. So, ultimately, as an overview, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners a more in-depth discussion of your research background and the emphasis of history that you specialize in?
Well, as you said, a lot of my work has been on the history of magic in the Middle Ages. And it's a topic that I've always been really, really interested in. And it probably, to be honest, it probably goes back to reading lots of fantasy books when I was a kid. You know, Narnia and things like that. I absolutely loved when I was a kid, and still do, to be honest. And I always knew I loved history. So I went to do a history degree. And as part of that, I did a third-year module, an in-depth module on love and marriage in the Middle Ages. Part of that, you got to read an awful lot of Arthurian literature, so romances about King Arthur and his knights. And I've been interested in those stories anyway. And I thought, yes, great, this is a chance to read some of these magical stories. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed working with the tutor, Professor David Davray. And so I went back to him when I was thinking about PhD topics and said, look, is there anything I could do maybe on the romances, maybe on magic? And we sort of banged some topics back and forth. And eventually he's a specialist in medieval marriage law. And he said, well, there's lots of canon law, lots of marriage law to do with magic that causes sexual impotency that stops people getting married. He said, well, why don't you think about looking at that? So I did, and that became my PhD. It expanded out into some other topics. But so I sort of came to it through that, really.
Fascinating. So would you definitively say that was your aha moment that really pushed you into the field of history, or was it a different moment entirely?
Well, it probably was. Yeah, that probably was my aha moment. And then being fortunate enough to get funding to actually do the PhD, because without funding, I wouldn't have done it. I'd have gone off and got a job doing something else. But I knew well before that I loved history. And one of my early aha moments was when I was in what the Brits call year 6 at primary school, when I was aged sort of 10 to 11. And we did a project. Our teacher was friends with the local vicar, and we did a project where we looked at the parish records. She persuaded him to let us photocopy all these 19th century parish records. And I absolutely loved doing it, tracing all these families. And I don't remember this, but my mum swears that I went back and said, Mummy, I want to be a historian. So maybe that was my aha moment many years before. but a lot of interests came together in sort of working on medieval magic.
Nice, nice. So now let's talk a little bit about your research and your topics of history. Now, from your research topics that you've discovered along the way, and probably numerous papers and dissertations you've written in your career as an historian, is there one that really stands out to you in terms of like really surprising you and breaking any myths you may have had about the medieval period?
I think, well, there are a couple of things I could go with here, but I think actually my PhD research that became the book on magic and impotence, it surprised me partly because it really led me to understand that something that sounds wacky to us, you go and tell people your PhD is on magic and impotence and they go, you what? But it's actually trying to think their way into why they took that so seriously, why they made laws about it, why they wrote serious medicine tracts about it. And actually just thinking about, well, getting into the period and thinking, well, we don't take this necessarily very seriously, or many people don't, but they obviously did. And trying to understand why that was, I really, really enjoyed that process of just trying to understand people who see the world very differently from us.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And talking a little bit more about your dissertation, Catherine, when you got the idea to write about this and research about this, ultimately, did you have the ending of your dissertation in mind of what you wanted to prove based upon the research that you were gathering?
Not really. I've never really worked like that. I know people who say they do, but for me, it's often about asking a question. The question could be something as broad as, what did they think about this? How did they deal with this? And then amassing the evidence. And usually what I want to prove comes to me quite late during the writing process. So there's usually a sort of first draft where I just kind of brain dump all the stuff I've got and all the bits I think are interesting. And then it's only as I go back and edit that I tend to think, oh, actually, this is the bit that is really important. And that's often in dialogue with reading other scholarship in the field and working out what they've done and what they've missed. So no, I don't usually go into things with a clear idea of what I want to argue, but I have a clear idea of what I want to know about, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when it comes to overall writing dissertation, I know a lot of us, when we write our papers, we usually have like a rough outline of, okay, what's the beginning going to be about? What's the middle going to be about? And what's the ending? But I've also talked to a lot of historians who have written their dissertations and have taken them into, the next level, which is like an academic book for publication, that they sometimes had rewritten it and gone a more spontaneous sort of approach where they have an idea, they know the ending, and the middle, it's not as set in stone and could go either way. How would you describe yourself as a writer in that regard?
I think I've got a bit more freer over the years, probably. My dissertation was fairly carefully planned, and the book that came out of that, it basically followed the structure of the dissertation, but making it much clearer what I was arguing and generally making it better and correcting mistakes I found in the dissertation. Since then, I've got much kind of freer about, I suppose, planning the structure. And the book I'm writing at the moment on infertility, it went through lots and lots of different structures. I tried doing it thematically. I tried doing it by different kinds of source material. And eventually, it's still thematic. But, I've moved it around lots and lots of times over some years before I kind of got to that point.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And when you were writing your dissertation and, of course, turning it into a book, ultimately, as the historian and as the writer of both, what was your goal going into both projects at the time? And ultimately, what was the promise that you were making, not just to yourself, but also your fellow peers, as well as prospective readers?
Well, I don't think I really knew what the goal was going into the thesis, other than I wanted to get a PhD. I was pretty clueless about how you then got a job in academia, although I was fairly clear I wanted to do that. So it was I guess the question of a lot of the dissertation was working out that process and working out, what can I do with this material? Can I do anything with it? Is this what I enjoy doing? But I suppose what I'd like the readers to get out of it is to understand some kind of pretty weird stuff that no one had really thought about in detail before, and to try and think about how that makes sense. When I went into the book, I was a little bit more clued up, and I was fairly clear that I had to get it published in a relatively short time frame to have a chance for my CV to have a chance at getting job interviews and so on. But beyond that, yeah, I wanted to kind of introduce people to how interesting this material was and get them to think about it a bit differently.
Absolutely, very true.
Going to have a wide audience, sorry, but hopefully those readers who read it will like it.
Definitely. And we'll go more in depth when we go about the marketing and business side of academic publishing. But before we get to that, there was a fan question. There are going to be a few fan questions sprinkled throughout the interview. One of my viewers asked Catherine is, in your journey in academia, getting your PhD, was there a teacher or teachers that really instilled in you a passion for history, who really left an imprint on you?
Well, we've talked a little bit about my my primary school teacher back when I was 10 or 11, Mrs. Pardy, who probably deserves a shout out for getting us all into 19th century records, which is probably quite a tough sell to 11-year-olds when I think about it. My PhD supervisor, David Davray, was absolutely brilliant. He was constantly enthusiastic and supportive, but also he'd always push me. We'd have all these supervisions where he'd say, "Have you got an argument?" And I'd go, "No, I found some interesting stuff." And, I still see him relatively regularly. He's someone who's always kind of been very much on my side, but in a way that's always encouraging me to do better. So he was someone who really inspired me. But I was lucky. At UCL, which is where I did my degree, I was lucky I had a number of really, really good teachers who taught me about the Middle Ages. I had a brilliant Celtic specialist called Wendy Davis, she did early medieval Celtic history. And we were all slightly scared of her because she was a very eminent woman. And most of the reading list was by her, is my memory. So you were always slightly nervous about disagreeing with anything in there. Although I think she'd have welcomed it if you had. But again, she was someone who was, in a kind of very kind way, was always pushing you to think harder about what you were saying and why you were saying it.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And this question has been brewing with me for a while now. It's actually from a previous guest. So in that interview I had with this particular guest, we talked about what does it mean to be an historian nowadays in the modern age. And in his research, he expressed that the term historian originally meant gaining experience to think critically and apply it to practical jobs in today's market. Originally, being a historian was, to think critically, to look outside the box and gain tools to use for other careers, other means. But now the term historian has gone beyond that to actually focus in on, just history of itself. Do you believe that is still the case, or do you think it's kind of like a mix of both, getting all the skills to apply it into other aspects of non-history related careers, but also further expanding upon the scholarship as it evolves over the years?
Yeah, I think it is both. I mean, you've got to be realistic. I teach history in a university. Most of my students are not going to go on to become professional historians. Most of them don't want to. So for them, it is going to be about how do you sell the skills you've developed to an employer? And that is about critical thinking. It's about analysis. It's about being able to assimilate complicated information and communicate that to somebody. So those kinds of skills are really important, I think. Focusing on them as well, it stops you getting too kind of niche. You don't want to get into a position where, as one of my colleagues puts it, you know more and more about less and less. But on the other hand, without being able to look at the sources for yourself without being able to try and ask questions that no one else has, or look at things in a slightly different way. Yeah, I would find my job a lot sadder, I think. You don't just want to be teaching people to think critically and all the rest of it.
Mhm.
You do want to teach them that, because you can't do good history without that. But you do also want to be encouraging them to think independently about the topic and to ask their own questions. And that's something I want to be
Very
doing
true.
as well.
Very, very true, Catherine. Very, very true. And this kind of leads into the follow-up question of what does it mean to be an historian in the digital age? Because being a historian, the field itself has changed greatly within the last 20 years or so. And especially those who decide to go the route of independent scholars or independent researchers. And of course, social media definitely plays a big role into that. A lot of historians that I've had on the show have social media presence, which you would not consider or think of 20 years or so when social media was still in its infancy. But now it seems impossible to be without social media to grow a platform, to grow an online presence. But it has also sparked a very important discussion and debate with the rise of AI generated history videos, information which may not be correct or may not be backed by any sources or scholars. And this intriguing discussion that I've seen in the historical community between academically trained historians and those with the term armchair historians, those that may not be academically trained, but those who truly do the research and produce historical content. Now, Catherine, I would like to hear your thoughts on this discussion, this debate, and in your opinion, in your words, what do you determine, or what does the term historian mean to you?
Oh, it's a good question, isn't it? And yes, as you probably guessed from how slow I am to respond on Instagram, I'm not great at social media. It's something I feel I ought to get my head around more than I do. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about social media debates, but I've not come across that one about the armchair versus the kind of real historians. I think you don't have to be academically trained. You don't have to be working in a university to be a historian, I'd say. One of the hats I have is I'm a trustee of a charity called the Devon and Cornwall Record Society, which publishes local history records. And there are lots of people doing great research in local history who don't have an academic background, but who are incredibly knowledgeable about the places they live and the kinds of records they work on. I think I suppose where being an academically trained historian pushes you is partly to develop those critical skills, to really develop the source analysis skills, to say, well, why does the source say this? Can we believe it? Thinking about the importance of genre, the importance of language. The other thing I think it pushes you to do is to ask the so what question. So this is very interesting. We know a lot about this topic, this place, these people. Why should other people care? And one of the things that academic publishing has always pushed me to do is to say, well, okay, I'm interested in this stuff, but can I explain to other people why it's important? But I think you can absolutely, there are many, as you said, there are many independent scholars who do that. There are many local historians who do that. So I don't think you have to be a kind of university historian or with a conventional background in order to be able to do that kind of work. So I've rather got off the topic of the digital age here. But we can always come back to that if you like.
Of course. And it actually does kind of go back into it, a good fallback, which is, in the digital age for historians in academia, it has forced us to branch out and really figure out what kind of history we want to produce. Like a lot of professors, a lot of well-rounded historians who have decided to produce content or talk about their work. Some examples, Dr. Thomas Smith, Dr. Stephen Tibble, his wife, who's also Dr. Tibble. They are incredible historians and academia, but they've also had to develop and create an online presence where before they were just interested in showcasing history to an audience. But that audience has changed. More so, it's from the digital variety, and that has forced us to go into the social media world, even though a lot of us are probably not comfortable with social media or don't want to use social media. And it also heightens our imposter syndrome, our anxiety, and can make us question from the discussions that people may leave if we are truly historians. So I would like to talk about that aspect of the imposter side. And I'm wondering, in your career, Catherine, has that ever come about where you have second guessed your own abilities as an historian and your research expertise?
Yeah, I think it happens to everyone, unless if any historian ever tells you that they have not felt this, they are lying. I'm willing to bet.
Mm,
Yeah, it's happened. I mean, most recently, it happened to me with the infertility book project. I sent it to a publisher. They sat on it for a while, and they came back and they said, "Nah, we don't like it." And I thought, I think it's great. What's wrong with it? And I really spent a long time thinking, what am I missing here? Am I not as good at this as I thought I was? But I mean, eventually, I kind of rejigged it and tried to take on board what they said and sent it to another publisher who said yes, fortunately. But I think there's a lot of rejection in academia. There's a lot of, nobody ever, you send journal articles off, nobody ever says, that's perfect, don't change anything. So everybody gets things rejected. You get journal articles rejected, you get grant applications rejected. And it's very, very, I think everybody sits there thinking, oh, is it me? Am I just not good enough at this? Job interviews like this. I went to a lot of job interviews before I got the job I am now. So yeah, I spent a lot of time second guessing. Was I really cut out for this? Was I good enough at it? Were other people better at articulating what they do? Are other people better on social media? Which is not something I'm particularly fantastic at. So yeah, I think a lot of people second guess themselves. I try and do it much less now. I try and recognize when I'm doing it and stop. I've got much better at that.
absolutely, absolutely. And this is also going forward, going again, talking about social media, but again, generative AI content in the history world. I've seen a lot of videos use generative AI either to make thumbnails, covers, and this has sparked another discussion of, does that diminish the research behind the video, or should we just consider it as a tool? Which AI is a tool. It's implemented in everything that we use, whether we like it or not. But generative AI, as I talked with a lot of people on the show, it does take away the human side because it mass produces content on a global scale, but creates a false sense of originality and creativity. Because as historians, we go all in for research topics. We put our blood, sweat, and tears, and yet there are those that will probably use AI to generate research topics that they've considered or thought of, and they're able to produce research papers on the fly. And I've talked with a lot of historians about that there has been some examples trickling into the academic world, being published in research papers and journals. So again, Catherine, I would like to hear your thoughts on this side of the historian world. And if you ever come across it personally in your research, whether you may have read a paper recently or have learned of a colleague that has gone through this, or overall your thoughts on generative AI in the world of the historian's field.
Oh, it's a problem, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I've thought about it most, I think, in the context of teaching, because
Yes.
there's a lot of worry that, will students use AI to write their essays? Will they use it in other ways? What's legitimate and what isn't there? And I don't think anyone's got a firm answer. I'm not sure how easy it would be to detect an essay written by AI. And I like to think I could, but who knows? Yeah, I'm sure AI will get cleverer. So partly, I think there's the issue of working out what you can legitimately use it for and what you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been talking to students about that who say, well, maybe I can use it for generating bibliography, but not for writing the essay. Is that okay, for example? And that's something where my university is doing quite a bit of work to try and work out what they think the rules are. So, I mean, I think there are huge implications for teaching, potentially. I haven't seen it so much with research yet, maybe just because I'm not looking, or maybe I'm naive. But, I mean, I think one of the real problems is that it can scrape your own original research, and someone else can then use that to generate something which may or may not look like what you've been doing. Well, certainly, the scandal they had some months ago where it turned out that Meta had been scraping all this illegal database of publications. And I put my name in, and pretty much everything I'd written was on there. And I thought, well, yeah, you could use even the kind of book reviews, which aren't very interesting. Yeah, I think there's a real worry that you can do that. You can spend your time writing, and then someone else can come on and just kind of scrape all the stuff off and write their own thing. And I mean, that's irritating for me, but fortunately I get a salary paid by a university. If you make a living out of writing, if you're an independent scholar, if you're like someone like Steve Tibble, who you mentioned earlier, that's a huge problem, because that's someone taking the work you do for your livelihood.
Very true. Very, very true. Now, this is another fan question that one of my viewers asked. And they ask, of course, your background is in medieval history and early modern European history, specializing on infertility and magic, of course. Is there another aspect of the medieval age or the medieval period that you would like to focus on in another book or for another research paper?
I'm not thinking very much past the infertility book at the moment, which I want to get finished, and also the popular history book I'm writing. I'd like to do more on history of medicine. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. And it's still, I think, comparatively under-researched. There are people doing brilliant work in it, but there's a lot that's not been done. So there's a 14th century doctor called John of Gadsden, who I'd like to look into a bit more. He writes a big medical encyclopedia, which is often dismissed as kind of being unoriginal or full of superstitious rubbish. I think it's quite interesting. He talks about his own experience as a doctor in there. I'd like to do more with John of Gadsden, I think. It's my kind of next projects over the horizon, possibly, which might have some magic in it and will probably have some fertility in it, but might be a bit different.
Nice. Now, on the topic of magic, this is something I've been really very fascinated to talk with you about, Catherine. In the medieval context, what have you determined or discovered to be magic in the medieval sense? Is it more of like herbs and natural remedies that we know as remedies, but during the time that they were being written about, were seen as magic?
Yeah, there's some of that. I mean, they have their own idea that if you're just taking a herbal remedy, then that's probably having some kind of a physical effect on your body, and it's not magic. So they don't necessarily see things like herbal remedies as magic themselves. Many of them will put that into the category of medicine. Where they start to worry, and I say the problem is that most of the views we've got on this are the views of the church, who are very interested in working out what's legitimate and what isn't. But where they tend to worry about magic is if you're doing something additional alongside those herbal remedies that they don't think can kind of work naturally. So are you saying words or incantations? Are you doing a ritual? Are you wearing something as an amulet where it couldn't have an effect on your body? So it tends to be the things they think actually go beyond herbal medicine to sort of not work naturally. That,
Absolutely,
is a red flag for churchmen.
Mm-hmm. And now let's jump ahead to the business side of being an historian and going about your book, Catherine. When you did get it, is it currently published or still in the process of publication?
Which one?
The one on infertility.
No, it's still, I'm editing what I hope is the final draft to send to the publisher.
All right. Well, then perhaps Okay, then we'll probably save that question for the next time. But what I will say for the business side of being an historian is this actually goes to what we talked about before about understanding, who our audience is.
Mm,
Now, when you are rewriting a dissertation to the academic publishing world, I imagine that the language that you've used in your research paper may have been tweaked just a little bit because there is this balance of you want to hit the historians, the very hardcore specialists in the field, but you also want to reach the general audience,
mm.
the public. So toning down on the academic jargon, it's definitely a must. So for you, Catherine, when rewriting your dissertation for the book version, how have you still been able to maintain your voice, your identity as the author and historian, but also realize that, not a lot of people are going to pick up on certain words that only academics will pick up?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Actually, I think it's really nice to talk about this because I don't think people talk enough about the kind of business side of being a historian and writing and academic writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did have to turn down the jargon because when you're writing a PhD, I mean, it is nice if it is readable, but ultimately what you're doing is trying to convince a certain number of people, a small number of people, that you meet the criteria for a PhD, that you know the field, that you can engage with it, that you can do original research. And obviously a publisher is going to want more than that. They're going to want something that is clearly going to interest a wider range of people. And certainly for my thesis book, that's pretty much just academics. It's published by an academic publisher. It costs a lot of money. You're not going to get general readers buying it, but they do want that kind of wider academic market, maybe undergraduate students, university libraries. So yeah, I did try and tone down the jargon a bit. I also really hate reading academic stuff that's full of jargon myself. So I tried to make it relatively clear, even when you're talking about lots of nerdy manuscript stuff. And so that meant basically going through the whole book, trying to liven up the language a little bit more, trying to think, how much detail is too much detail here? Do I need everything I put in the thesis to prove that I really have looked at everything? Or can you just kind of get away with slightly fewer examples? So I didn't restructure it. Some people did, but there was a rewriting process just to make it flow better, just to not make it quite so clunky, I suppose.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And when you're, of course, you're still in the editing phase and the rewritten phase, did you have to gain any news sources for the book version that you didn't include in the dissertation?
Few, yeah. It was about filling in gaps rather than doing a huge range of new research, because I was lucky in that what I had was kind of about book sized already. But there were things I'd missed. And one of the examiners in my thesis defense said, well, actually, you could look at this, this, and this. And I thought, well, I better do that because that's good advice. So I did. I went round, I filled in gaps. I checked my readings. I realized I read something wrong the first time around. But I didn't do lots and lots of new research at that stage, partly because the advice from the examiners was, if you want to stand a chance of getting an academic job, try and get it out relatively quickly. And
yes,
that advice varies for everybody, but they said, well, don't actually unpick it and start again if you can get away with not doing that. So I didn't,
very
and then I
true.
saved the kind of new research for the next project.
Very, very true. Very, very true. And this is another question when it talks about, the business side of being a historian is networking. Networking is huge in the history field. I know people say networking is vital in every field, which it is. But I would dare say in the liberal arts, in the humanities, it's even more imperative because it opens new doors and avenues. And it brings about a discussion that doesn't get talked about as much, which is, as we mentioned before, the practicality of being an historian. And there's not a lot of real on-job training or workshops about it. And I
Yeah.
feel that is a big issue that needs to be addressed. And I'll give some context for this. When I was getting my master's in history at San Francisco State here in California, I went to a workshop, and it was probably one of the best experiences of my academic career, because that gave me the confidence to apply my history skills, my analytical skills, my research skills, and become a freelance magazine writer specializing in history. And I published a lot of publications in the UK, a lot in the United States, really flexing my research skills as well as my storytelling, because history is storytelling in a way. You want it to be an engaging story from beginning to end, no matter what the topic is. Yes, you want to inform. You may also want to persuade, but you also want to entertain your readers now and then. Ultimately, Catherine, do you feel, especially now in the digital age and the modern age, that there should be workshops in universities to help history students really figure out the kind of person they want to be? Because as you mentioned earlier, not everyone wants to be an historian. Not everyone wants to go down the road of an academic. No one wants to go into the world of government employee. Both are very vital, but a lot want to carve their own path, forge that middle path.
Yeah. And I think universities, certainly the university I work at now, is more clued up about doing that than when I was doing a PhD. There wasn't really anything like that when I was doing a PhD. Maybe I didn't look hard enough. Maybe the Careers Centre would have been helpful if I'd gone. But we do try and put on more workshops now, thinking about the different things people do with PhDs, trying to get our former students back who haven't gone into academia to talk about what it was they did. But yeah, I think we could do more than that, because you develop a huge number of skills on studying history, whether that's at undergraduate level or master's or PhD. And I think students, sometimes they lack the confidence to realize that until they go out into the world. And they may also, it was interesting what you said about not realizing that you could also tell stories and do other things independently.
Yes.
We teach people to analyze, we teach people to argue, but we don't necessarily teach them to write engagingly.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very true.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's only come to me. I've started writing a popular history book and working with the editor on that. It's really interesting how differently, how they bang on about storytelling, about emotion, about tell me what it was like. And I think, whoa, I've never done this before. This is weird, but it's kind of fun. But yeah, maybe we should teach those skills a little more than we do.
Absolutely. And kind of on that note, regarding the business side of being a historian, looking back on your career thus far, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of, your research, your journey specifically, paths, avenues, or do you think that everything happens, for a reason in the field of history?
Trying to think. I've been very lucky. I've been very happy in the opportunities that have come to me and the decisions I've made. So I'm not sure there's anything I do really differently. I'm very grateful that I took opportunities to branch out. For example, when I got involved in the Maltese stuff, that was because a colleague approached me saying, would you like to come in on my funding application? I'm very grateful I said yes to that. I could easily have said, no, I'm too busy. I think one of the things that I've had to learn, certainly since having a family, is that you can't say yes to everything. I'm very bad at saying no to things. I think a lot of historians are, a lot of academics are, because you think, oh yeah, that sounds great, I'll do that. So I probably need to get better at prioritizing what it is I want to do.
Absolutely
maybe
true.
I could have done that earlier, but yeah, no, I'm reasonably happy with how things have gone overall, I think. And I've learned from even the things that haven't come off. I've learned from them. You're not successful at everything.
Very true. Very, very true. And we're almost near the end of this incredible discussion, Catherine. So there's a few last questions that I do want to touch on before we end. And this one I have been saving for a while. And I've done some reflective about it, tweaking it a little bit. And I'm going to try to combine 3 questions into one very large discussion. And that is, of course, especially as historians, especially when it comes to writing research papers and writing dissertations and writing the one thing that really gets our name out there. Ultimately, as historians, we can write nonstop. We can write about whatever topic of history that we want. But when it comes to our dissertation, when it comes to the document that we believe is going to put our name on the map, our name in the discussions of fellow historians, there has to come a point where we need to decide, when do we stop with the writing? When do we stop with the researching? When do we know it's finished? And then ultimately, from that stage, is the ending satisfying? Does the research really emphasize what we've been discussing for the last 50 pages? Has it been worth it? Does it achieve what we want it to? And then ultimately, this other one, which comes down to visions and edits, do the edits still maintain the integrity of the original source? So I would like to hear your thoughts on this, Catherine, and what your overall thoughts are for, historians that may be thinking about that, and overall, research papers and academic publishing in general, tying into this internal reflection of, when do we know when to stop writing and just trust our work?
Yeah, that's really tricky, isn't it? Because we're never going to know everything. There's always more. There's always another source you can look at, or another piece of scholarship. And I suppose when you're doing something like a thesis, partly it's down to time, isn't it? You've got to produce a thesis in, 3 to 4 years in the UK. The American system's rather different. So there comes a point when you have to, or at least if you don't start writing, your supervisor is there saying, "Oi, start writing. Stop researching." But yeah, I mean, I think for me, sometimes it's about getting to diminishing returns. So you start finding a lot of material that basically says the same thing, that doesn't seem to be adding very much. And that's a sign normally for me to say, well, there might be something brilliant just over the horizon, but probably I've got enough. And it's also about, I think, wanting to get something finished. You start getting fed up with a topic yourself after a while, and you have to kind of say, right, I'm going to write something. I'm going to see what I've got. Maybe I'll write a draft and then fill in the gaps if parts of it feel a bit sketchy, and go from there. But it is tricky because historians, we all love sitting in an archive or a library and just gathering interesting stuff. But yeah, so it is really hard to kind of make that pivot to write then, I think. Writing is really hard. So it's easy to sort of put that off and do something else. But yeah, it tends to be when I get either start feeling stale or get diminishing returns. One of the things I'm doing is to try and make myself write sooner, even if it's not a very good draft, just so that I know where I'm going and I know what I need to gather still. Because yeah, I'm someone who likes to gather everything and then write, and I'm trying to step away from that a little bit, I think. Yeah, I'm sure I spend too much time kind of procrastinating otherwise.
Absolutely, Catherine. And now we arrive at the final 2 questions of this amazing historian's interview. We talked about a lot of things in this discussion, from your research expertise in magic and infertility, what you've learned as an historian, the people who've helped you along the way, your thoughts on some of the topics that are being discussed in the academic world, and so forth. Ultimately, what do you want people to take away from your research and your approach to teaching history? And finally, what is your word of wisdom, your advice to fellow students who want to pursue not only a degree in history, but possibly build a career upon it?
Well, let's take the first one first. I think one of the things I want people to take away is just that the Middle Ages is interesting and varied and people do all kinds of weird stuff. They don't necessarily do as they're told. It's very easy to think the church told everyone what to think and that's what they thought, but it's much more creative and dynamic than that. And it's also, for me, really fun to just understand how people who viewed the world very differently, why did it make sense to them to believe in certain kinds of magic that we don't? So just kind of helping other people to make that leap to see how this stuff makes sense. It's something I really want to do in my own writing and in my teaching, and master the skills, the research skills and the critical skills that they need to do that. The other question was, about advice to people.
Yes.
Thinking about history as a career. One of that is, the main thing I would say probably is, do something that you find really, really interesting. Pursue a topic that you find really fascinating. Because if you go on to write an undergrad dissertation, a master's, PhD thesis, you're the one who's got to live with it for a very long time. You've got to do the work. You've got to be motivated. So pursue something you personally find really, really exciting, and find other specialists in the area who can help you do that. And that might be tutors at your own university. It might mean reaching out to academics elsewhere if you're looking for sort of moving for a master's or a PhD program. And it might be about networking, going to workshops, conferences, finding people who you really enjoy talking to about your research, who will push you to think in different ways. The other thing is probably the word of warning I always give my students as well, is that there are not very many jobs doing medieval history. There are some, but there's not very many. So have a backup plan as well that you will find fun and satisfying, that where you can take those skills. That's a slightly miserable note to end on, though, isn't it? But yeah, pursue what you find really interesting and think about the skills you need to do that. So think about, do you need languages? Do you need paleography? Is there a way to get training on things like that? So kind of be strategic, but also follow what your passion is.
Very true. Very, very true. And just to add further to that, as a good capping off to this amazing discussion, is also really look at, why do you want to go into the world of history? Because it's not an industry to make a lot of money. As I have viewed it, there are two paths. There's one to be an historian and one to be known as an historian. Two are very, very different in the sense of mindset and approach. One is dedicated to the scholarship. The other is growing a fan base, and I use that term very loosely, gaining recognition. Ultimately, both are going to lead to the same goal. But you have to be realistic in your approach. Yes, definitely research something that you are passionate about teaching, that you are passionate about showcasing, but really be practical in your approach to history. And definitely start off small and work big. Whether it's like writing little articles, starting a blog, or joining a fellow history society, local or international, and just building upon it and just seeing what kind of historian you want to be. And on that note, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing historians interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Dr. Catherine Ryder, for coming on the show. We wish her the very best in her academic journey, as well as her eventual publication of her book. Can't wait to see when it gets released. Now, Catherine, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect? And do you have any special announcements you'd like to share, i.e. any conferences you're going to be attending, any speaks that you're going to be hosting, anything like that?
Well, firstly, thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's been a really fun hour discussing all of this, and it's made me think, which is great as well. You can find me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Catherine Ryder Medieval, or on LinkedIn just under my name. And I'm relatively regular checking both of those. So I should, if I don't respond instantly, I will respond at some point. I'm hopefully going to be speaking at the International Medieval Congress in the University of Leeds in the UK in the summer. They haven't said yes yet, but I'm hoping they will. So I shall be there for any medieval studies people who are going to Leeds. I'm also speaking much more locally in Exeter at a symposium on the history of witchcraft and women on Saturday, the 22nd of November. And that's run by an outfit called Seed Talks. They have their own website. So me and several colleagues and other people will be talking about various aspects of witchcraft and women on the 22nd of November.
Nice. Very, very nice. I will link all that down below in the description of this video, viewers and listeners. Again, thank you so much for your love and support and joining us for another amazing interview today here on the show. A huge thank you to Dr. Catherine Ryder for coming on the show. And if you'd like to see her back in a follow-up interview or possibly a different episode entirely, i.e. the Historian's Lounge, talking more in depth about magic, a little bit of witchcraft, as well as medieval law and infertility, then comment down below and I will try to make it happen. Until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, asking you to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, have a wonderful morning, everyone, and we'll see you all in the final episodes later this week.